All right, so this is the lesson from Unit 2 on westward expansion. Before we do that, let's take a look at the first 5 presidents. Just as a reminder, the first president, of course, is George Washington. Remember, he's from Virginia. He's a Virginia planter. He was also the guy from that pretty much started the French and Indian War by going to Fort Duquesne and telling the French to abandon where they were because he was part of the British Army at the time. He set several precedents, though, okay? Don't get that word precedent confused with president, with an S. Precedent is a tradition or standard that is set by someone who came before you, okay? So if, you know, I'm teaching history, Mr. Doolittle taught history before me, and one precedent he set was to have good test scores. So I try to follow that precedent by having good test scores too, okay? Washington set several precedents. First of all, he only served 2 terms. At the time, there was no law saying that you could only serve 2 terms. That comes later with the 22nd Amendment to the United States Constitution, okay? But he served 2 terms. Each term is 4 years each, and then he voluntarily went back to the House, okay? He did not want to continue to keep power for all of that time. He also set the precedent of peaceful transfer of power. So as John Adams became the 2nd president, there was a peaceful transfer of power from Washington's administration to Adams's administration. And then when Jefferson became president and we had a whole new party in the Democratic Republicans, as we go from John Adams to Jefferson, there's also a peaceful transfer of power. That's very important. Also, they were trying to figure out what to call the President of the United States. Was it going to be some elaborate name like Your Excellency or Your Majesty or something like that? No, George Washington only wanted to be called Mr. President, and to this day, we only call the President Mr. President, nothing fancy. Also, after the Whiskey Rebellion, he set the precedent of the president enforcing the law. He's going to enforce the law, okay? So the Whiskey Rebellion sets that precedent, but it's very similar to Shays' Rebellion in that Shays' Rebellion shows that the Articles of Confederation is too weak. The Whiskey Rebellion is going to show that the Constitution is strong enough for us to continue to function, okay? Our second president is John Adams. He's a Federalist. He was the first vice president of the United States under George Washington. Now, while both of Washington's elections had been unanimous, that means everybody voted for George Washington. That was not true after him. The election of 1796 was bitterly contested, and it was John Adams versus Thomas Jefferson. So Adams won to become the 2nd president of the United States by a 71 to 68 margin in the Electoral College. However, there was a little hiccup in the way things were done at that time. Whoever came first became president. Now today, if you come in second, that means you lost. But back then, if you came in 2nd place, that meant you became vice president. So the person with the most votes became president, and the person with the 2nd most votes became the vice president. Now you can imagine what kind of problems there's going to be with Adams, who is a Federalist, being president, and Thomas Jefferson, who came in 2nd, is a Democratic Republican, and he's going to be vice president. Obviously, they don't like each other. They see the world differently, and they're not going to get along at all. And they're going to talk a lot of stuff about each other in the paper. So, therefore, Adams became president. His political rival, Jefferson, became vice president. And this presented many difficulties for 2 people who did not like each other to have to try and work together. Adams is only going to serve 1 term. And the main reason he's going to serve 1 term is because he did some very unpopular stuff. The first thing he did was called the Alien and Sedition Acts. And you need to remember that. That's going to be the thing that's going to mess him up. So the trouble with Adams is that, first of all, he had lots of experience, but his administration had lots of problems. Being the vice president of the United States up under Washington, he had more executive experience than anybody else who was running for office. He was a natural choice. He was smart. But to try to keep the Democratic Republicans and Jefferson from criticizing his move, first of all, he had control of Congress, so he was able to do a lot of things. And first and foremost is he passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. These acts made it more difficult to become a citizen of the United States for immigrants. So it made it harder to become a citizen. Why? Because new citizens that were immigrants tended to vote for the other party. He didn't want them to have those votes, so that was part of the Alien and Sedition Acts. It also gave the president the power to deport or kick out of the country any immigrant that they deemed was dangerous. So if he didn't like you, he could just simply kick you out of the country, and that's not American at all. The act limited freedom of speech, and this is probably the worst part of it, and the press, and made it illegal to write, publish, or speak anything against the government. If your newspaper, if you had a newspaper and it said bad things about the president in the newspaper, he could send the army in to shut your newspaper down. If you personally said things against the government, he could lock you up. That's a clear violation of the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, part of the Bill of Rights, which gives you freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, and all that other stuff. So the response to the Alien and Sedition Acts was not good. The people saw it for what it was, and they never forgave Adams for it. So Jefferson and fellow Democrat, Republican, and the father of our Constitution, James Madison, argued against it. And they said that states could refuse to enforce the Alien and Sedition Acts. Now, that's another problem. That's this idea of states' rights. That's the idea that states should be more powerful than the federal government, and they should be able to do whatever they want to do. In this case, they're arguing for the ability to nullify a federal law that they don't like. That's called nullification. That word's going to pop up again very shortly in this unit, so look for it. This was the beginning of the concept of states' rights. In addition to anger about the Alien and Sedition Acts, the economy was very slow. People usually vote with their wallets. If the economy's bad, people generally don't vote a candidate back into office for president, even if they are an incumbent and have been there. But if the economy's good, they generally vote them back in. This led to Adams' defeat in the election of 1800 after only serving one term. Could he have served more? Yeah, he could have served a lot more. So the election of 1800, Adams is defeated, and Thomas Jefferson, his own vice president, defeats him to become president, and he is our first Democratic Republican president. Also, Congress went from being controlled by the Federalists to being controlled by Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party. So there is a big shift in party in our government. Also, the two candidates with the most votes were both Democratic Republicans. So Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. So Jefferson becomes president, Burr becomes vice president, each with 73 electoral votes. And that threw the election into the House of Representatives. So whenever there's a tie, they don't decide just in another election. The Constitution says that the House of Representatives gets to pick whoever they want to become president. Well, Jefferson received the most votes in the House of Representatives, and Aaron Burr, who was also in his same party, became vice president. So that actually worked out pretty okay because they were from the same party. So Thomas Jefferson had been Washington's Secretary of State. He was Adams's vice president. He was anti-federalist, founded the Democratic Republicans. He was the writer of the Declaration of Independence, and he was responsible for the Louisiana Purchase in our next unit. So he's done a whole lot of stuff. He also founded the University of Virginia, if you didn't know, and he was a governor of Virginia at one time. When he was younger, he had red hair. They called him the red-haired wonder. So he did a whole lot of stuff. Another thing, before I move off of him, he also fought a particular war that we were in called the Barbary Wars, where we actually fought an actual war against some pirates. Worth your time to look into sometime. Our fourth president was the father of our Constitution, James Madison from Orange, Virginia. The War of 1812, which we'll discuss in the next unit, officially began under Madison, And he had been Jefferson's Secretary of State, and he had to deal with British impressment, which is one of those causes that's going to lead to the War of 1812, which is our second struggle for independence. Impressment, as you'll see, simply means that they were kidnapping our Americans and forcing them to serve on British ships, forcing them to be in the British Navy. And that's something that we're not going to put up with. That's what impressment means. The fifth president was James Monroe. He had been Madison's Secretary of State, and the rivalry between the Federalists and Democratic Republicans pretty much goes away after the War of 1812. Everybody was basically a Democratic Republican and got along. After we beat the British for a second time, we're feeling pretty good about ourselves, and we see no reason to fight with each other. The Federalists had kind of gone away, and this is just called the era of good feelings. Monroe wanted to warn European nations not to get involved in the Americas, or the United States would get involved with them, and this is called the Monroe Doctrine. Him and his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, come up with that and tell Europeans to stay out of America. This is our neighborhood. That's what this political cartoon is. Basically, we got a stop sign. We're holding it up against Europe. We're saying, stop. This is our neighborhood. You guys stay out of our hemisphere. And they say, of course, what do you mean by off limits? We mean out. Stay out and don't come back. Okay, there's another one. We're telling Europeans to stay out. All right, that's going to lead us to several things that we need to know. Westward expansion, a few little tied ends that we need to tie up here. So success with the Articles. Well, there were a couple of successes with the Articles of Confederation before we moved on to the Constitution. I wanted to make sure you knew what those successes were. One of the only successes was in managing new territories. Now, after we win the American Revolution, we've got all this new land in the Ohio River Valley that we've got to figure out how to manage. So we're operating under the Articles of Confederation, so we have to do something with that land. And that land was what we got with the 1783 Treaty of Paris, which ended the American Revolution. The Ohio River Valley was obtained through the treaty, and we were successful in administering it at least till we got the new Constitution. Several states claimed a portion of the new land, but they reluctantly gave it up in order to have their debts from the Revolutionary War forgiven. So Congress actually hoped to sell the lands to the public in order to get funds to run the government. Because under the Articles, you remember, one of the weaknesses was they could not raise taxes. So they couldn't have taxes. So how else does the government make money? Well, this is how they're going to do it. They're going to sell little pieces of these land, a little piece at a time. The problem was that many people in many states claimed the same land. And to fix that, Congress passed what was called the Land Ordinance of 1785. The Land Ordinance of 1785 is going to fix that. What was it? Well, the Land Ordinance of 1785 was significant because it provided a way to divide the land into 6 square mile rectangular towns. Those towns, or townships, were then divided into 36 sections, each measuring 1 square mile. Because the minimum sale price was $640, the buyers were mainly land speculators who would turn around and resell the land to others moving west in order to make a profit. So it's kind of like scalpers who will buy a ticket to a game kind of cheap, but then the day of the game they sell it really expensive to make money off of it. That's what a lot of people were doing with these little, square mile pieces of property to make money off of it. But there was one really important piece to this. This land ordinance provided a way to have public schools for the first time in the United States. So an important part of the land ordinance was that money made from the 16th parcel of land in each township would be used to establish public schools. So there are 36, it was 6 by 6, 6 times 6 is 36, 6 by 6, so there were 36 sections. The 16th section, the money made from that would be used in order to make a public school and pay for a teacher and all of that sort of thing. The money made from selling the land through the land ordinance in 1785 was successful in making money for the U.S. government under the Articles because they were facing debt from fighting the war, but couldn't raise taxes in order to make any money. Also, we had the problem of the Northwest Territory. Why is it called the Northwest Territory? Well, of all the land we owned, it was north and to the west. So it's above the Ohio River, it's to the east of Spanish Louisiana and the Mississippi River, it's to the west of the Appalachian Mountains, and it's to the south of the Great Lakes. That's what we call the Northwest Territory. It's eventually going to become Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. That's what this land is going to become. But at the time, it was unsettled territory. We've got to have a way to turn this into new states. We don't want a bunch of colonies, because that makes us no better than the British. They're the ones with all the colonies. We want states where people have the ability to contribute, just like they have in the original 13 states. These new states are going to be no different than the original 13 colonies as they became states. So in 1787, Congress passed the Northwest Ordinance. This is also under the Articles of Confederation before we ever got the Constitution. That's why this is one of the successes. This new law would provide a way for new territories to become part of the USA. The law also, this is interesting, banned slavery in the Northwest Territory, making the Ohio River Valley the new boundary between free and slave regions. So if you went north of the Ohio River, you were in non-slave territory. You were in free territory. To keep order in the new region, Congress would appoint a governor, a secretary, and 3 judges to preside over each region. Okay? So when you watch these old westerns, there's 1 governor, there's 1 secretary, and 3 judges. That's why those judges, when somebody acted up, they didn't have time to keep people on trial forever and ever. That's why they hanged a lot of people during that time. And you can see it, you know, kind of Western justice administered out there like you might see in the old Western movies. Becoming states. That's what this land ordinance allowed, Northwest Ordinance. Becoming full states like the original 13 colonies was a long process of steps, and it was all based on population. Number 1, once a territory reached 5,000 free male adults, okay, so basically white men, then it could elect its own local assembly, okay? When the territory reached 60,000 free people living in it, then they could apply for full statehood. Ohio is the very first new state to enter the Union under this new system from the Northwest Ordinance. Also, we see this new concept of a westward expansion. The United States is going to expand westward towards the Pacific Ocean. We've got the East Coast where Georgia is on the Atlantic. We got the West Coast today where California is on the Pacific. We're gradually working our way towards the western coast. This is westward expansion of our borders. It was very important that the territories had a path to statehood rather than permanently remaining territories. It looked too much like colonies like the British had. The original 13 states were not special under this arrangement. All new states were just like them, had the same amount of power based on population. Of course, they'd have 2 senators in the Senate, and they'd have enough people in the House of Representatives based on their population. That's our bicameral legislature that we came up with. The laws of the nation would follow its citizens across the continent as new states were added in the West. And this fulfills both the new idea of manifest destiny, which is this idea that God wants America to own all the land from sea to shining sea, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. People began to really believe that it was God's ordained plan that America would own all of that land. It's called manifest destiny. That's a destiny for America that's manifest from heaven, that we're supposed to own all of that land. And it provided for public education in each new territory and state. So these are 2 of the big things, land ordinance and the Northwest Ordinance, all part of westward expansion. I don't know how well you can see this picture, but this is the westward expansion. This is the Manifest Destiny picture that pops up every year on the milestone. This picture right here is of this woman, Lady Liberty. She's going west. She's flying out west. And as she's going, that's not a Bible in her hand. That says, if you look really close, school book. She's taking public education west with her. She's also got in her hand here the telegraph line. So they're able to communicate through the telegraph. She's also taking the trains out there. So the railroad's going to move out west, and what we call the Transcontinental Railroad. Trans means across, so it's transcontinental. Also, you can see the buffalo are running away. The Native Americans are running away. You've got settlers in their covered wagons. You've got farmers as they're spreading that way, and everything, the wild animals are running from them. So this is Manifest Destiny, Westward Expansion. That is exactly what this picture is about, and it pops up over and over and over again. So pay attention to it, emblazon this in your mind, and don't forget it. And that'll be it for this lesson.